Okay, I'm back. Hang on, let me share my slides again. I thought I was fancy, but I'm not. Okay. So hi everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm in Australia now, but in 3 weeks we'll be back in America where I grew up. So just thought I'd talk about EMA, which is a study design that I am a big fan of and use all the time and tend to force my colleagues to use it too. So I'll talk a bit about that, specifically in the habit context. So before I do that, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land and water and pay my respect to the elders of all First Nations people of Australia and where everyone is around the world. I'm currently on Darumble country, and we'll leave that there. So my favorite part of my job is the people I get to work with. Let's see, these crew. You'll see Ben Gardner there. We first met and walked around and found a coffee shop called Habit, which was quite exciting. So that's a picture of Ben taking a picture of the Habit sign that you might be seeing every once in a while on our presentations. Just to give you a bit of background on who I am, I grew up in Utah in a little town called Lehi. If you've ever seen the 1980s movie Footloose with Kevin Bacon, it was filmed in my hometown. And then I went to Indiana University for my bachelor's of psychology degree, worked with a social development lab, so learned a lot about emotion regulation and temperament. And then went through a lot of different hair phases, but that one shown in the middle is where I got my master's degree at Penn State University under David Conroy, and got it in sport and exercise psychology. Did the master's and PhD there and learned a lot about automatic regulation and understanding motivation, specifically towards physical activity. And then in 2013, I moved to Australia for a postdoc and have been here 11 years and 2 kids later. So as was hinted earlier, in August, I'll be starting a new position in University of South Carolina with the Arnold Palmer of the School of Arnold Palmer of Public Health, and back to my homeland. So it's pretty exciting for us. A lot of the ideas I'm talking about today are influenced by heaps of people, several in the crowd included within that. So those and many others are included in those pictures below. And also, I just want to acknowledge before we start that one of my favorite parts of my job is the lab I work with. I work with an amazing group of students all over the country in Australia, and actually international as well. So grateful for them and how they've helped move things along with these studies that I'll be talking about today too. Okay. So I'm happy I'll try to make this relatively short because I kind of want to make it more of a discussion. So I'll keep an eye on time. Also because we have State of the Origin tonight, a big rugby game. So I got to get to that too. But basically today I wanted to talk about ecological momentary assessment. So I'm going to talk about why I think it's really important and then kind of dive into what it is and how we do it. And throughout that, I'm going to have examples of some of the studies that we've done using this method and some others. So we'll go. So one thing I learned both as an undergrad, but mostly at Penn State, was how dynamic everything and how most of the history of motivational science is focused on a really static trait-like mentality of what motivation is. And the more we study it, the more we realize it's really dynamic. This is a hypothetical plot, but basically it's just the idea that there's a lot of different ways states and moods and behaviors can change over time. And if we're not capturing it well, if we're only measuring it once or twice, we're actually missing a lot of this beautiful nuances. Sometimes you'll hear when we talk about validity of measures that we talk about retest validity. And if something is correlated over time, then it means that it's a good measure. I've never understood that because a lot of what I study, motivation and affect and behavior, is meant to change within person across time. And it does that in different ways. It can be this gradual growth, which is typically what we think of when we think of habits forming. It can be the stage growth, which some would argue is the different stages of change for motivation, although we can dispute that depending on the behavior. And then there's also fluctuations, which is really my bread and butter. I love seeing moment to moment and day-to-day changes in our motivation and our behavior and trying to model that. So that's really where I think EMA has a role in our field. Also, motivation is context dependent. Me and Ben and Dave Conroy and an engineer named Constantino at Penn State wrestled around this idea of a computational model of habit. And basically all it is an equation that describes how habits form as a function of what context you're in and what behaviors you're doing. And through this discussion, we realized that that really, depending on the context you're in, your motivation is quite different. And also, the cues that are dictating a lot of our motivation, including habits, really can differ state to state or person to person. So the main takeaways here are just that motivation changes over time, and it depends on what context you're in. This notion really stuck to me quite early on when I first came to Central Queensland University and did a study where the supervisor I worked with, Cornel, had this online physical activity intervention, and we wanted to help people with depression. So we just gave them this generic website about physical activity and just targeted people with depression. And it was really missing the mark with this target population. And since that study and beyond, I've really thought about context as both an external and internal thing. So just the idea that it's not only time that these EMA designs can help capture, but it's also the internal and external states. Hang on.
Where's my guitar?
Can you go downstairs, please?
I need a piece of chocolate.
Sorry. Can you go ask Daddy? Go, please.
What is it?
Go downstairs, please.
What is it?
There's one right there. Bexy. Hang on, team. I got to do some parenting. All right, I'm back. Anyway, so the idea is with ecological momentary assessment, it's not just about tracking things over time, it's tracking things in different contexts, and that can be where you are, who you're with, what mood you're in. Okay, so my favorite articles about EMA are from Schiffman and Stone. They're excellent. They're actually clinical psychology researchers, and they started using EMA to track clinical symptoms over time. But it's been done in affect and mood a lot as well. But this is a great article that I have referenced on the bottom, and I gave Ben the slides, so I'm happy for him to share them with you. But basically, the idea of an EMA study is that it's repeated sampling of individuals' behaviors and experiences in real time in the natural environment. And those three things are really key. So I'm going to dive into those word by word. So ecological. So these data are collected in real world context. And as I just talked about, our motivation is really context specific. Something that you say when you're being interviewed or when you're filling out a survey may be very different than how you're actually feeling when you're in a different context, like home, laying on the couch. We talked a lot about this recently. I've been working with some physios, some physiotherapists, and they get quite frustrated because they have their patients in the clinic that say they're quite motivated to exercise and do the exercises that they're given, but then they go home and they realize actually when there's other options and when I'm being lazy, all that motivation that I felt in the office is gone. So we're talking about helping clinicians work through motivation from a context specific time point. So help them plan for when they're in context, when they're not feeling motivated. Really training people that motivation will change over time and to be ready when it's low has been really exciting for some of the clinicians we've been working with. But jumping back to the EMA design, that's all we're doing is we're really trying to capture constructs in situ, like when they're happening, as they're going about their day-to-day lives. And of course, this reduces some of the social response biases and the retrospective reflections from people. So it's in real life, so it's how it is, which is useful for affect and motivation and things that fluctuate. To give you an example of this, this is an early study we did it in Australia when I learned about FIFO work, which is the fly in and fly out workers that a lot of people in Queensland and Western Australia have as their work shift. So a lot of times one partner will go live on site for a week or 2 weeks and then go home for a week. And this shift in context from living on site to being home with their partner and their family is really tough to transition to, and their motivation and health behaviors differ quite dramatically between those contexts. These are some word clouds, which I love to show data this way. This is a study that me and Ben and Grace Vincent, a sleep researcher at CQU, I refer to this study as the duct tape EMA study because we didn't have a budget to do this. So we would slowly collect data as opportunities arose over the last few years and ask participants 6 times a day, what are you doing? Where are you? Who are you with? How habitual is it for you? How intentional is it? And collected a lot of context data. We let them have an open response for what they were doing, and these are the types of things people would say, with the bigger words, meaning that's more frequently reported by people. So not surprisingly, a lot of people were working and watching TV. There was a surprising amount of driving while they were being prompted, sleeping, but understanding where per person is in context is really important, and that's a strength of that EMA. This is the data from that same study on where people are. So you know what they're doing, you know where they are. Not surprisingly, most were at home, but there's a few different options. And the exciting part of this type of measurement is once you know the context someone's in, you can start thinking about tailoring interventions for that context. With the machine learning and AI regression models we have now, you can predict someone's motivation and behavior based on their context. And we're working on some of those individualized models now. So it could be that you give them personalized interventions depending on, oh, okay, you're at home, now we're going to give you this type of intervention. Or, okay, you're at the bar with your daughter, we'll do something different. Another context, this is just a posture, not surprisingly, sitting was the most common in that study. Just a quick distraction from talking measurement to give you some of the results from this study. We kind of did this study because one of Wendy Wood's studies we cite I probably have cited more than 100 times myself, says how habitual daily life is. And it just says, oh, you know, there's a lot of what we do through day-to-day life is habitual. I thought I could do that study a bit stronger with an EMA type design. And we asked people how habitual it was to start doing the behavior, which is habitual instigation, and how habitual the execution of that behavior was, and how intentional the behavior was that they were doing when they were prompted. I can get in the weeds of how we decided what not habit versus habit is, but it was a data-driven approach. And those are some of the numbers we saw from that study. So not surprisingly, a lot of what we do in our day-to-day life is habitual, but also a lot is also intentional. I just thought I'd pop this up too. This is our the matrix that talks about that ratio of how many of the day-to-day behaviors were habitual and intentional across those different settings. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but I'll keep rolling. But the reason we do these types of studies is, yeah, so you could describe what a daily life looks like by modeling moments. So even though we only assess people 6 times a day in that study for a week, I think, we assess a lot of people. And because of the random intervals with which we assess people, you can make a representation of what a typical day looks like, even though you actually have only done it 6 times. And there's a way to figure out the power for these types of studies, how many people you need and how many assessments you need. So that's one reason to use EMA. Another one, which is quite common, especially if I'm doing the analyses in the paper, is these between versus within person effects. So you can actually consider if your associations are because of individual differences or because of those fluctuations we talked about, how things bounce around over time. So one finding we found from this is that when people are sleepier than usual, they tend to stick to their habits. So if you're exhausted, you're just going to do what you typically do. But that's not found at the between person level. And that's really interesting because that means that if we had studied this in a cross-sectional perspective, then it wouldn't have shown up. So we'd say, oh, actually, sleepiness and habit aren't related. But they are, but it's your typical level of sleepiness that matters. It's not if you were more or less sleepy than another person. I also have to put this slide up because my colleague Grace, who's our sleep researcher on this team, I made this for her for a talk she was doing, and she was aghast. And I think it's a really important slide. This is the actual association between sleepiness and habit. And I think it's important because it shows, yes, in general, there's an association that when you're more sleepy, you tend to have to be doing something more habitual. But also, this is really messy. Like, I love showing people how really messy data is because it says, okay, if you were to draw a line that matches all these blue lines, it would be kind of positive. But each of those blue lines is one individual, and each black dot is one occasion for each of those individuals. So when you look at it like that, you realize what's the point of even saying an average effect? It's a personal driven effect. Some people there's no association, some people there's a negative association. So drilling down into the context and the meaning of why are there some really strong associations for some people and less for others, I think is quite interesting too. Okay, so now we got to the M in EMA, the momentary. This is where we talk about, this is the current state that they're feeling. So you're asking about how they're feeling currently or really very recent ones, rather than asking for a recall or a summary over longer periods. This is where you get at some of that reduction of measurement artifact. So it's easier to remember how you felt last minute as opposed to over the last week. I just wanted to make an important distinction between EMA and repeated measure studies, which are slightly different. I do a lot of repeated measure studies. So if you do daily diary studies or they fill out a survey every week or every month, you're not actually doing an EMA study, you're just doing repeated measures. So you have the ecological, you're capturing maybe in the real time, but it's still retrospective, it's just in smaller amounts. So that's just a nuance there. And that's the key difference is if you're not asking how are you feeling right in that moment, it's probably a repeated measures as opposed to the EMA. Okay, so when is this relevant? I'm speaking to the crowd that loves habits, so we're quite interested in how habits form and understanding that shift from that really intentional motivation to a more automatic habitual regulation of behavior. And theoretically, that happens through repetition of the behavior in the same context. So thank goodness for Ben and Pippa for driving this initiative, and several of you were involved in this study. When COVID happens, I had young children, and it was a game changer for us. We were only locked down for 2 weeks. Some of Australia was locked down for much, much longer. And of course, across the world, it was quite different. But for habit researchers, it was a huge moment in time where we could investigate asking several countries, if not the entire globe, to do something differently than they've done in the past. So thank goodness for Ben and Pippa who drove this multinational study where we had 5 countries, 900 people. This is a repeated measure study. So every 2 weeks, we asked them to complete a survey and ask them about their motivation for these 5 behaviors. as their habits and intentions and identity, a few other things. It was a massive data set, but that's repeated measures because we are asking about behavior and habit over time. But the very cool part of this data set is we had a lot of power, so we could do a lot of fun time series stuff that you typically can't do with only 100 or so participants. So theoretically, this should be familiar to most of you guys, the idea that as habits form, it goes in this slope where it starts and it's quite effortful and you need a bit more support. But as you start making gains, the gains are quite fast early on, and then they plateau and your habit kind of meets this peak. Thank you, Pippa, for figuring this out early for us. So this curve has been modeled over and over and is used as a theory for how we help people form habits. And this study that we did with the COVID behaviors gave us a chance to track behaviors from a new start. We did a trajectory analysis, cluster analysis of the trajectories. So instead of looking at how specific variables track together, we looked at how change in a variable tracked together and if there were certain profiles in how people's habits formed. We found, surprisingly, that habits either formed, started to degrade over time, or were stable and high. So in general, there were about 3 ways habits changed across this time. But again, this is so different from every person. Yes, when you take the average over 400 or 500 people, you tend to have these 3 profiles. But when you actually look at each individual's habit trajectory, they're also unique. And I find that really interesting. And that's how these EMA and time series data can help inform us when interventions need to occur, for who, and under what context. I think it's really important. So that's a fun data set we have that's repeated measures, not EMA. Okay, and the last part of EMA is these assessments. This is just the idea that there's a lot of different ways to do EMA studies, and main point is that they're doing multiple assessments so you can picture how those experiences and behavior vary over time and across those contexts. So you're actually picking up the true dynamics of motivation or behavior or whatever you're assessing over time. I just wanted to point out that there's a few different types of EMA studies, and it depends on what your research questions are, which one's the most relevant. So you have event contingent. This is where you just want to capture when a person is doing a certain behavior. So I study physical activity a lot. So sometimes you'll have an EMA study where you're actually only interested when they start being physically active, and that would be event contingent. So Jackie Marr is a pro at this type of data collection. She has accelerometers, and then once you hit a certain MET energy equivalent on the accelerometer, it prompts that person to fill out a survey. Random sampling is the type of sampling that I talked about before, where you pick how many times throughout a day you want to give people an assessment. And then typically the way that's random is you separate it into blocks of time and randomize within. So for that EMA habit study we did, we had participants tell us 6 2-hour blocks of when we could send them a message. And within those 2-hour blocks, we randomized when they got that prompt. So you could have one prompt and then 2 hours later have another one, or it could be almost 4 hours between prompts, but that's random across the whole time series. And that way you're not just picking up on the same time each day. The burst design. So this is probably my favorite EMA design. A burst design is how you can capture different time scales. I'll give you an example, but basically it's different intensities of assessments over different time frames. So you might do momentary, where you're doing 6 assessments a day, but then you might only do that for 1 week and then wait 3 months and then do another 6 days and then wait 3 months and then do another 6 days. And that way you can capture really slow to change variables and really quick day-to-day fluctuations. And you're also reducing the burden on participants. I'll give you an example of that in a few slides. And the other one I wanted to mention was the EMA plus design. So this is something we did with that FIFO study, that fly in, fly out. we did a typical ecological momentary assessment, but we also added a qualitative element. Until 10 years ago, I hated qualitative data because I love statistics, but there's so much more you can learn from it. And giving you perspective on what the numbers mean and the richness is just, there's nothing like it. So sometimes we would do an EMA study, but then stop halfway through and ask people to do an interview, a semi-structured interview, or even open response questions, something that gives us that richness. And you can do that repeated times as well. Although if Ben is doing your qualitative analysis, he would prefer fewer interviews because it's a lot of work to do qualitative analyses. Okay, so this is an example. I mentioned Jackie Marr, who is at UNC Greensboro, and she was a PhD student at Penn State with me. I love these studies, so I just wanted to share them with you guys. This is an EMA study she did with physical activity and sedentary behavior. This is an example of event contingent. So she captured when people were being physical activity or being physically active and when they were being sedentary. What we did with the data, she asked them who they were with, what they were doing. We captured the time of day. And then I did, it's a very nerdy score, but it's entropy, and it's used a lot in biology to picture how much atoms are moving. But it gives you a measure of how consistent categorical data is. So if they say they're with their partner 6 times, and it's the same person you're with every time you're prompted, then you'll have a quite low entropy score. But if you're with someone different every time you're prompted, that's a high entropy score. And then I just reverse them. So I captured context stability. So the more you're with the same person or in the same spot, the higher your context stability score. And this was an interesting one because we found that the more you were in physical context when you started being active, the more active you tended to be over time. Social context stability was driving the sedentary behavior. The thing that drove me nuts as a habit researcher is that this context stability didn't predict habit score. So it didn't predict change in habit. It only predicted change in behavior. And I was surprised at that finding because the theory is that the more you do a behavior in a certain context, the more likely it is to form into a habit. But just wait. We just had another meeting about this today. Jackie's gonna submit this paper very soon. Very excited. So she had a very similar data set, event contingent, a sample of at-risk minority and low-income adults in North Carolina. And we separated people into adopters of physical activity, those who have just started, and maintainers. So those have been regularly physically active for some time. We still had kind of funky findings with these context stability. So it's not that the more stable your contexts were in, the more behavior you tended to do. It wasn't a great predictor, and still did not predict habit score, that change in habit, as per the self-reported behavior automaticity index. But after pondering over this for a while, I realized that it's not that the same context will work for every person. So it's not that every person in this sample who's around the same people over time will form a habit, because a person's cue that's triggering their habit may be different for some people as opposed to others. So if you've heard me talk about this before, you will have heard that I love to say it's a vibe. Like, I don't think habits are triggered by a specific thing, like a time of day or a person or something you see. I think it's like a vibe. It's like this multifactorial, tricky thing to capture. So I did a vibe check in this data. Basically, what I did is found for each person, I found which characteristic of a context was most stable for them. So I said, okay, if this person, when they were physically active, they tended to be by the same person, and that was their strongest, most stable context, then I would use that score. So I made this new variable called vibe check, and it was my way of guessing what the cue was that was driving these habits for these people. And that's what predicted change in habit score. So it's not context stability of a certain type of context. It depends on who you are. And that makes total sense to me. So context stability still works with this data set. It will still predict habit, but it's not a specific context. It's idiosyncratic. It depends on the person. So I'm pretty excited by that. We're still working on the name. Jackie says she won't let me call it a vibe check. She won't let the variable be called that, but we'll get it in there somewhere. Okay, so that was just my overview of these different types of EMA descriptions. I just mentioned that I would talk about a burst design. And here's that. So when I was at Penn State, Dave Conroy and Neelam Ram and Aaron Pincus got an NIH grant to do this really cool study. And it's just fortuitous that I was there at this time and was able to work on this project. And we thought it was so technologically advanced, but now I went back to our old website and pulled these images, and it cracks me up because we bought every participant a phone, which is down there at the bottom, very stylish. And we had like a little stylus, and they would do their EMA designs. But this is what that burst design looked like. So we were capturing people's social interactions, and we would do it for 21 days in a row, and then they'd have a month break. And then we do it for another 21 days, and then they'd have another month break. And this way, we studied people's social interactions, how they felt, their health behaviors, some motivation. It was so much data. And the great part about this was we could then track how quick variables were to change. So we could tell some emotions change faster than others, but then we could also assess how that changed over this full year that we were capturing. And because we had a wide age range in our sample, we could also look at age differences as well. So it was a lot of different ways to capture change over time. Very cool. Okay, and then I just thought I'd stick at the end of this some websites. How? I don't have a great go-to. I will say you don't need a lot of money to do a good EMA study. The study that we duct taped together, we just used an online survey software called Qualtrics, and a SMS program. So an SMS software where you could pay to send people messages at certain times. And then we had students design these automated processes for randomizing when they get these text messages. And it just sent a link to the Qualtrics survey that they had to do. So I think we paid them a little bit to participate, but other than sorting out the process and making sure that was streamlined, it wasn't that big of a deal. The data analysis is the best part. I love that. I'm not going to give you a whole tutorial on that, but I did think it's worth sending you some of these links that are quite useful. But I thought I'd just open it up and see what people think and what we want to talk about. And thanks to all the people who pay for me. And I love open science. So there. It's very hard to talk to not empty, no cameras. So feel free to turn your cameras back on. Hey guys.
Oh yeah, thank you. That was amazing and super interesting, and makes me want to, well, whenever I talk to it, makes me want to do a million more studies. I just had a really little question. You said when you found their individual vibe, presumably that you did that in some clever statistical way. You didn't like manually sit there for each person and go, oh, that one seems to be the one that's their most consistent one.
Yeah, it was just some modeling, but it was just finding the maximum context stability score. So it was I was quite thrilled with those findings, for the record.
Yeah, that's very good. What were the different types of context that could be the same? Was it specific people? And
yeah, it was dependent on what Jackie captured, and we actually included affect in there as well. So positive to negative affect and activation to deactivation, time, social, where they were, location.
Okay.
And it was just, this is nerdy, but I'll go there for you, Pippa. But If it was categorical data, I did that entropy score, so it's just how consistent they were. But if it was continuous, like time or affect, it was just the standard deviation for that person across the whole time. So I'm just saying how much variability is there in that score for that person?
Amazing. That's very exciting. I really want to read the paper.
Good. I hope Jackie writes it this week while I'm moving.
And calls it a vibe.
She better call it. I know. I'm working on it.
Okay. Do other people have questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to hear just perspectives. I know I rushed through a lot, but I thought I'd throw it all at you and see what we wanted to discuss.
Anybody else?
Oh, I know. I see some of those names. You guys don't want to be quiet. Come on. You all have thoughts on this. I'm happy to go over anything or discuss things I wish I would have known or analyses or what's useful.
All right, while we're waiting for other people, I'll throw in a question. It's not even about EMA, it's more about the kind of between and within participant thing. Do you think we've been getting everything wrong then? You know, in terms of between participant effects, you know, almost everything, those kind of correlational studies that have been done since the mid-90s till, I mean, we're still doing them. Are we just looking at the wrong thing?
Well, I mean, I think our theories are within person theories and our studies are between person studies, right? So when you think about motivation, even the worst theories we have, like theory of planned behavior, I think I can say that in this crowd, right? Yeah. They still are saying when you feel a certain way, it will predict a certain behavior. So when you have strong intentions, it will say that you have more behavior. And that is a within person process. You don't say people who have stronger intentions tend to do this behavior more, but that's what we're studying. So yeah, I think there are research questions that are important to look at between person, but most of what we're actually interested in is change over time.
I'm just going to keep asking questions if everyone else is going to be quiet.
Oh,
We'll just have a little chat amongst the three of us. Oh no, look, someone else has a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm having some difficulties with my camera, so I'm just gonna ask a question. Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, what is the difference between EMA and experience sampling method? Because they seem to be very similar, but I'm not sure if they're a concept that's used interchangeably or are they different?
Yeah, it's a great question. I use them interchangeably. I'm not sure everyone does. But sometimes people use experience sampling as the event contingent, so that, you know, you're capturing that one moment specifically. But it depends. I would treat them as the same.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, and I should mention that Jen Dunton at South Carolina, no, South California, the other USC, she has made a really user-friendly way to analyze EMA data that separates these between and within person. So I do it kind of how I've been doing it for 15 years, but Jen Dunton and the team there have a brilliant website that you just plug in numbers and make it relatively user-friendly. So it's worth having a look at her stuff if you are interested in digging into that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I feel like I overwhelmed everyone. Yeah, Barbara.
Thanks, Amanda. Definitely a lot of room for thought. I'm reflecting on the conversation you've been having about the between and within person thing. I'm not even sure if this is a question or just some thoughts to think about, but it sort of strikes me as being a little bit like the trait and state thing, that it is going to include both. So you're going to have your overall motivation, and some people are definitely more motivated to engage in physical activity generally than others. But then within that, you're going to have your within person thing of, yes, I'm motivated to be healthy, but today I'm motivated to eat cake. So, you know, that's going to win right now. So, I mean, should we actually be doing the analysis that includes the two of them together rather than separating them out so that we can say,
Yeah,
Sorry,
I mean,
you
it's a
said
great
yes. I
point.
wasn't sure there was more coming.
It's a great point, Barbara. And that's typically what we do. Like it's the traditional way to do it is just take that person's average score across the entire point you've collected them, and that's their between person variable. And then for the assessment, the within person part is just the residual from that person's mean. So it's if you have a positive residual, it means you have a higher score than usual for you. Whereas if it's a lower score, it's less typical for you. So that's exactly right. The only thing I'd say, and only because reviewers have made it my life hard when I use the term trait, is because typically, just because I've measured you 7 times in a week doesn't mean I know how you generally are, right? It's still a trait. It's just a week instead of your whole lifetime. So I think there's some dispute about when you ask, how are you feeling right now? And you average that over a certain time, is that enough to say it's a trait? Sometimes we get kicked on that, but yeah, theoretically, you're spot on with that.
Yeah, so sorry, I'll just, someone else has their hand up, but just to follow up on that, we've started using a trait measure of habit to try and actually tap into that. So looking at whether or not you are habitually doing things, and then using the self-report measures, self-report automaticity measures as the state measures of habit. So to try and get to that more long-term, how much you like routine and habit and doing things in a consistent way. So we're still collecting that data currently, but I shall tell you how it goes.
Yeah, that's
I'm
interesting because that's, yeah, go Ben. Good, you'll
No, I
know
was
the
going to say
scale
just
name.
before Suzanne jumps in, just to follow up on Barbara's point, I don't know if this is valid or not, but then so you can do between participant analysis, within participant. Can you do any interaction?
You should know this. You've written papers on this.
No, well, you've written the results. You've done the method of results. I then write the rest. So
Yeah, yeah. So that yes, so in 2014, I wrote that paper that's you're going to do what your habits are unless you have really strong intentions, and that's exactly what that was. So we just measured habit once in that study, and it was across time, and just said, okay, this is how habitual it is for this person, and their physical activity was associated with that habit strength unless on the day-to-day that intention was strong, and that's a cross-level interaction. That's what it is. It's so for some people, in this case, people with strong habits, that intention behavior association at the momentary level will look different. But and Barbara, I was going to follow up and just say, yeah, I know there's that scale of routineness and habitualness, and that's cool to me because that's trait. Instead of thinking about it over time, it's over context, right? So the SRBAI is behavior specific, whereas that one's just a general tendency to have habits, which is another level. You could have 3-level models in there.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Is it Susie? Sorry, I can't see your full name on my screen. Susan.
Absolutely fine. So thank you very much for the talk, and I'm very sorry that I can't turn my camera on, and I'm a bit sick. I hope you can hear me well.
Yeah.
So I have a question about the difference between momentary assessment and repeated measurement. Because when is the moment to measure habit in a longitudinal design? So to describe this design a bit more, the participants take a sports course every week, and it is clear to me that the moment to ask them about the affect is during the sports activity or immediately after. But when is the best time then to ask them about their habit? Also, is it right after the sports course, a day later, or at a random level?
Great question. So you have both parts in that design. You have the EMA part where you're asking how you're feeling right now, like the affect, and that's the event contingent. So you're trying to capture them in that class, but you're also going to have just the repeated measures. So for habit, you typically, maybe I'm wrong on this, but you typically don't want to know how habitual is this for you right now in this moment. Rather, it's because we assume it's a slower to change variable. So typically what I would do, Susan, is have different levels of assessment. So I might have a daily survey or a weekly survey as well as those EMA parts. some people have a really long initial survey and a final up survey where you can ask habit and some other things that are slower to change or don't change. And then you can use that in the modeling of EMA data. But yeah, you don't want to ask people habit that many times, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, thank you.
I was going to ask something similar about that, because obviously by asking people things, that can influence the thing that you're asking them about or influence other things. So probably asking them about affect is probably okay. You just, how are you feeling about this right now? They can say, I love it, I hate it, whatever. And it doesn't really, you know, probably it's not too. But the problem with habits is that they're supposed to be happening outside our awareness. And so by asking people about them in the moment, we can then kind of actually make the behavior less habitual. Because if they were about to do something and then you say, why are you about to do that? And then they go, oh, it would be an intervention, right? That's what we'd want to do if we wanted to change. If people wanted to change their habits, that's exactly what we would want to do. We would want to interrupt them just before their actions so that it became conscious and they made a different choice. So it gets a bit more complicated with habits, doesn't it? About when to ask them.
But that is hilarious, because that is exactly what Charles Abraham asked me after I talked about some of this stuff at that keynote. He's like, by asking someone about habit, you're intervening with them. And I was like, oh, that's too deep for me, Charles. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's because they say monitor your bad habits, right? That's how, if you can, and that's what, when I talk to clinicians, I say, stop having people self-monitor their behavior, have them self-monitor their cues and the rewards. Like, I don't care how much you're doing the behavior. I care why you're doing it, what reward you're getting out of it, and what's around you or how you're feeling when you're doing it. If we can shift monitoring to that, then hopefully that would be better. But yeah, as far as asking people about habit intervention, absolutely. I mean, anytime you're bothering someone as much as we tend to do with these studies, you're changing their behavior. There is some evidence, at least with movement data, that it takes about 5 days for people to get over the intervention effect. So a really good EMA study will measure people's physical activity and sedentary behavior for a week, throw that data out, and then say, okay, this is actually their day-to-day life. But of course, that'll differ person by person. I don't know, just the more repeated measures and EMA data I see, the less I believe in average effects. You know, like you look at this data and you're like, wait, this isn't a 0.25 effect. This depends on who you are and what's happening. It's just so idiosyncratic. But the cool part is our interventions are starting to catch up. Like we're working with one of my students to model an intervention depending on their habit curve. So when they start getting a habit, we'll give them more adoptive intervention. But when they start hitting whatever their plateau is, we can start giving them some more maintenance and satisfying and barriers. But it's not time-based, it's that person's plateau for their habit curve.
And then just checking in. I always say, I think it's once you've got a habit, it's the checking on it every now and again to check, because if your context has changed or something's changed, you can have lost it. So you don't need as much intervention, but you still need something to check it hasn't gone.
Well, and the cool part, Pippa, is that there's this 10,000 steps program here in Queensland where they have like 800,000 people signed up and they just monitor their physical activity steps. And we've given them, once they sign up for this program, we give them these email reminders like, welcome to the program and here's how to be physically active. And we actually time the email reactions to how they're doing to the habit curve. It's group level at this point, but so that they'll actually get different emails and more like slower boosts between if they're maintaining their habit. But when they fall, we go, oh crap, we got to remind them why they're doing this. It's cool.
Brilliant. It's very exciting. Yep.
Hi. So have you had any problems with engagement? I'm kind of worried that people will start dropping out after 10 Qualtrics surveys, or they'll give bad quality answers.
Yes. Yes, we do. Fewer questions is good. And you're going to have heaps of dropout. That's why most EMA studies do these between and within, because you actually don't need that much power, and dropping out is not as big a concern because you're just grouping everyone's data to get together. If you want to do some of the time series and the growth curve where you're looking at time, That's more of an issue. It's a pain and people hate it. And the people that drop out tend to be quite different, right? So
Yeah.
yes.
So do you just
Get
keep
good.
chasing up over email, or do you have any tips on how to get better at that?
We prorate our incentives. So if you're giving them incentive, I'll say, okay, I'll give you $15 for doing the study, but then I'll give you another 35 if you do 80% of the assessments or something like that. That tends to work well, but you know, it's an issue and you plan for it, but also as long as it's, you know, 15% or lower, you can kind of guess what people, you're getting so much data from people that if there's some dropout, you can actually kind of model it and predict it anyway. But dropout's kind of an interesting outcome in itself, depending on what your research questions are, of course, but it's hard.
Yeah, great ideas still,
And
thank you.
Yeah, and I would say the least success we've had is through email. Text messages tend to be better for engagement. I don't know if anyone else has feedback. I know I'm not the only one that's done these type of studies on here. So other recommendations, but it's the same as any intervention follow-up, right? I think actually I take that back. I think quicker assessments, like within a week, it's easier to give someone than waiting 3 months and then having them do it, like because their context will change and their motivation is dynamic. But I'm happy to hear from everyone else what they think about engagement. It's terrible. I hate it. And especially as the statistician, I really hate it.
Yeah, makes sense.
You should see some of Ben's data sets. Ew.
On that note, I think we'll call this to an end.
Okay. Does anybody else have any other thoughts before we let Amanda go to her rugby match, was it?
Yeah, I got to go watch Queensland beat New South Wales.
Excellent. Okay.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was really,
Thanks,
really
everybody.
interesting.
I'm
Thank
happy
you.
to, yeah, feel free to, I was going to say email me, but don't because I'm moving countries. So
Email
you
you
can
in a
email
month
me,
or
but
two.
yeah, you give me a month and then I'll respond. Thanks, everybody.
Good luck with
Thanks.
the move.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.